Gonna go ahead and get sorry about that. We're gonna go ahead and get started tonight. Apologies in advance. My webcam is something's wrong with the settings, so I won't be on camera tonight. But thank you so much everybody for being with us tonight. My name's Carl Blair. I am TCRP's senior election protection attorney, and I'm joined by my colleague Veronica Worms, who is a the voting rights policy attorney. So thanks for being with us tonight. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. So tonight's presentation is called All About Voting Machines. And just a little bit about TCRP in case you don't know. We are a 501c3 nonpartisan.
We don't see the PowerPoint.
Oh, that might help if I share the screen. Sorry about that. There we go, everybody. Apologies. All right, can everybody see my screen now?
Looks good.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Just a housekeeping note, if you have any questions, Veronica is going to be monitoring the chat, and we're going to have a question and answer session at the end of tonight's presentation. So please feel free to put any questions that you have right in the chat. All right, so yeah, like I was saying a second ago, tonight's presentation is entitled All About Voting Machines. And for anybody who may not know about TCRP, we are a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit. We were founded in 1990. And we currently have 3 programs. Our Beyond Borders team deals with border and immigration issues. Our criminal legal program deals with criminal justice issues. And then, of course, the team that Veronica and I are part of, Voting Rights. And in the Voting Rights team, we advocate for our fellow Texas voters through every step of the voting process. All right, so this is the third in a series of 4 presentations that we're giving throughout the month of September. We are calling it our Democracy Deep Dive series. You'll see we talked about Texas voter registration laws. Last week, we talked about election resource allocation. Tonight, of course, is about voting machines. Next week, if you're available, we'd love to have you come join us. We're going to do a presentation on UOCAVA with a good friends of ours over at Common Defense. They are a pro-democracy veterans organization, and we're going to talk about military voting issues next week. If you missed any of our presentations previously, or you just really want to see me talk about voting machines again, within the next 2 or 3 days, we'll be posting the recording of this presentation on our YouTube channel that you can see the link at the bottom. And we have the presentations from the voter registration and election resource allocation presentations already posted on our YouTube channel. We'd also like to give a special shout out, special thanks to the American Constitution Society, and specifically their Austin, DFW, and Houston chapters for sponsoring this presentation series. So if you haven't gotten a chance to ever see the work that they do, put a link to their website right there. We take every chance we can to work with them. They're a fantastic organization. All right, and with that, that's all our housekeeping. So let's jump into a roadmap of tonight's presentation. So first section is going to be talking about the types of voting systems used in Texas. Then we're going to talk about voting system certification, how voting systems are tested, and then how this voting system equipment is procured, allocated, and delivered. So let's dive in. So on the first section, types of voting systems, we're going to talk about some definitions that are in the Texas Election Code, just some terminology that we need to know going forward for the rest of our presentation tonight. And then we're going to talk about the actual methods of voting in Texas, like how do our fellow Texans actually cast their vote when they're in their polling location. All right, so I put some citations here. So if you ever want to actually look up these definitions, or if you see something else in this realm and you're not sure what the definition is, that way you have a guide where you can look in the election code. All right, so let's start going through some of this terminology, right? So the very first one is voting system. And that is a method of casting and processing votes. So this includes the procedures for casting and processing votes, programs, operating manuals, software, tabulating cards, printouts, equipment. This is the whole thing. So this is not only the voting machine itself, this is the scanner, if it's an optical scan voting machine that reads your ballot, it's the check-in machine, it's just everything. So that is the broad category. So narrowing it down a little bit, There are also electronic voting systems, and that's a voting system in which the ballots are automatically counted and the results are automatically tabulated by the use of an electronically operated apparatus. And then what is a voting machine? What's the legal definition of a voting machine? That's an apparatus on which voters cast their votes. That machine records each vote and furnishes a total of the number of votes cast for the candidates and for and against the measures on the ballot. So when we say voting machines, this is what most people are thinking of, right? They're not thinking of the entire voting system. They're focused on this voting machine specifically. All right. A couple of more, and these are a little bit shorter. Voting system is voting system equipment, and that's any kind of mechanical, electromechanical, or electronic apparatus for use in a voting system. Automatic tabulating equipment, that's equipment other than the voting machine itself. It compiles vote totals by sorting ballots, by reading ballots, scanning ballots, or electronic data processing. So this is just any equipment that actually compiles the vote totals. And then last is a ballot marking device. And that's a voting system with an electronic interface that allows a voter to mark a paper ballot. And you'll see many of these many of these terms pop up as we continue through this presentation. So I just wanted to make sure that we all have, we're all on the same page about what these terms actually mean in the legal sense that we're talking about tonight. All right, so moving out of definitions, and let's talk about the actual methods of voting in Texas. First method, of course, is paper ballots. The quote unquote traditional or old school approach. You have pen and paper, basically. There are also optical scan machines, and this is where voters are going to mark their ballot by hand or machine, and then the ballot itself is scanned for tabulation on another piece of equipment. So this bullet point here is important. It'll be important when we talk about President Trump's executive order from this March. But optical scan machines in Texas can utilize what's known as optical character recognition, or OCR. And in that case, the scanning machine, the scanner itself is actually reading each of the individual letters that's on the ballot. Or some of the optical scan machines utilize a QR code or a barcode. So once the ballot is printed out from the voting machine, it puts the information that denotes which candidates, which measures the voter voted for. It puts that into a little QR code or a barcode, and it's actually that barcode or QR code that is read by the scanner. So yeah, just remember that. Keep that in the back of your mind. We will definitely come back to that particular issue. And so the third and final method of voting in Texas is what's known as a direct recording electronic, or DRE device. And these are the devices that utilize touchscreens or buttons, and they electronically record the individual vote and a cumulative vote total. And I put some pictures from ES&S software and Hart InterCivic on the right-hand side of the screen. Those two, the one on the left is the ES&S Express Vote, and the one on the right is the Hart InterCivic Verity Duo. Those are two of the most commonly used voting machines in the state of Texas. All right, so kind of going based on those pictures, all currently certified voting systems in Texas are made by either ES&S or Hart InterCivic. They're the only two companies that have any certified voting systems at this moment in Texas. If you ever want to know what type of voting system your county uses, the Secretary of State does maintain a list. They have it updated. I believe that last update was June of this year, so very recent. And then, if you or somebody you may know, wants to know, how do I use this voting machine? How do I use this ES&S machine, or how do I use the Hart InterCivic machine? Both of the companies all provide how-to videos and diagrams, written instructions for their various machines on their company's websites at the links that I provided right there. All right, so now that we've got some terminology down, we've kind of looked at which actual machines our fellow Texans are using to vote. Let's kind of back up in time a little bit. So we're going to talk about what's known as voting system certification. All right, and we'll get into what that actually means. There's a federal level of certification and a state level of certification. And then I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, President Trump's March 2025 executive order, and that deals in part with voting system certification. So I wanted to make sure to bring that up to everybody's attention tonight. All right, so just generally speaking, voting system certification, just kind of general information about it. Texas is one of 11 states plus the District of Columbia that require that voting systems obtain certification by a federal agency known as the Election Assistance Commission, or the EAC. We'll talk about the EAC and what their role is in just a second. And in fact, Section 122.0013 of the Texas Election Code requires that all voting machines used in Texas be certified by both the EAC and the Secretary of State. So in Texas, all of our voting systems are certified at the federal level and the state level. There are some minor differences. Excuse me. There are some minor differences in the certification procedures that the EAC and the Secretary of State use, but they are roughly generally equivalent, right? That includes rigorous testing. Multiple experts are consulted throughout the entire process. They both have lengthy processes before the voting machine is actually certified. So this is not something, a voting machine certification is not something that can be done in a week or a month even. Sometimes it can take 6, 7, 8+ months. So this is not something that can be done overnight. All right, so I promised we were going to talk about the Election Assistance Commission, or the EAC. So the EAC was created in 2002 through the Help America Vote Act. You might have heard of that before. It's better known as HAVA. And the creation of the Election Assistance Commission was a large part of HAVA. The EAC is an independent bipartisan agency, so they are supposed to be independent of the executive, so the president in this case. Bipartisan means that there are 4 commissioners. They're nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. However, legally, no more than 2 commissioners can be from the same political party. So how that's played out in real life, there have always been 2 Democratic commissioners and 2 Republican commissioners. The relevant responsibilities of the EAC, they don't deal only with voting machine or voting system certification. But for our purposes tonight, we're going to look at something called the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines. The EAC is the agency that adopts or amends those. And then we are going to look at their role in the certifying and decertifying of voting systems at the federal level. All right, so let's talk about the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, or VVSGs. Sorry, there are a lot of acronyms in this presentation, but that is unfortunately how this whole process is kind of described and laid out. So the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, what those are is periodically, there's not a set amount of time or there's not a specific date when the EAC has to do this, but periodically the EAC, they're going to adopt a set of standards that voting systems must meet to obtain certification. And it's these standards that are the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines. So HAVA gives the EAC the sole authority to adopt new VVSGs or to amend existing VVSGs. There's also a lengthy and highly technical formal process for the adoption or amendment of the VVSGs that the EAC has to follow. So adoption of a new set of voluntary voting system guidelines doesn't have any impact on the certification status of a previously certified voting system, right? So this is not something that once a new system is passed, there's no blanket decertification of earlier voting machines. I put a couple of sources on the bottom here that kind of explain, well, the first is actually a link to the current VVSGs. That's VVSG 2.0. The EAC is very early in the process of talking about adopting a new set of VVSGs, which would be known as VVSG 2.1, but they're very early in that process right now. And then the second just kind of goes into a little bit more detail about what these VVSGs mean, how are they utilized at the state level, like what do they mean for states? But yeah, those are 2 sources directly from the Election Assistance Commission if you're interested in doing a little bit more looking into this. All right, so let's talk about the actual certification process, right? So we've talked about VVSGs. We have an idea of what the EAC's role in all this process is. Let's look a little bit more in depth about the certification process specifically. So the EAC has the sole authority to certify or decertify voting systems at the federal level, right? And much like when they're adopting or amending the VVSGs, there's a very formal process for this decertification or certification process. And the EAC does have to follow their own procedures and rules that they've put into place for how to actually do this decertification or certification. It's something that's very important when we get to the discussion about President Trump's executive order, is that all of these determinations of whether to certify or decertify a voting system, they have to be individualized. So that means every single voting system that's put up for certification has to be judged on its own merits. Every single system that is being decertified is going to be judged on its own merits its own merits as well. Sorry about that. So yeah, all of these decisions have to be individualized. Each voting system that's submitted for certification undergoes rigorous testing by multiple experts again to ensure that it meets or exceeds the applicable VVSG requirements. And then voting systems are only decertified if they do not meet the applicable requirements, they've been modified or changed without following proper procedures, or the quality, configuration, or compliance of the voting machine is in question. So the voting systems are only decertified in a very limited number of cases. If you want to actually, again, another source here that actually goes through how the testing and certification process actually works. It provides those rules and those guidelines that we've been talking about. But yeah, so that's another resource from the EAC for y'all to look at if you would like to. Just to give you an idea of what the process actually looks like, this is the quote unquote simplified graph that the EAC put together. As you can see, it's multiple steps. Looks like 14 different steps, right? And each one of these steps has to be followed. There are, sub procedures, if you will, for each one of these steps have their own sets of procedures and rules that the EAC, the manufacturer, and then the laboratories who are actually doing the testing all have to follow for each one of these 14 different steps. But roughly, the manufacturer is going to submit an application. The laboratory that's going to be testing it meets with the manufacturer. There are testing plans submitted. The EAC reviews and approves those testing plans. Then the testing is actually done. And then there's a back and forth if there are any discrepancies or any deficiencies that are noted in the voting system. Then the EAC has a test report that's sent to them from the laboratory. They make an initial decision on the certification. More testing is done. And only after that point in time is it what's known as a certificate of conformance. That just means that the voting system being tested has met or exceeded the VVSG requirements. Only after all of that point in time, the executive director of the EAC approves the certification. And then after all of those previous steps, that at that point in time is when the voting system is officially and legally certified by the EAC. So yeah, it's a very lengthy process, very highly technical. Multiple experts from various parties are involved in the testing. Yeah, it's a very involved and detailed process. All right, so that's the federal certification level. So let's talk about how the Secretary of State certifies voting machines and voting systems in Texas. No surprise, the Secretary of State must approve any voting system before it can be used in an election in Texas. But the voting system in question must already be certified by the EAC before the Secretary of State even begins its own certification process. So it has to go through that entire chart worth of steps, that months, if not a year or two worth of steps before the Secretary of State will even begin their own certification process. So the way that the procedure works in Texas, the Secretary of State appoints 2 examiners, the Attorney General appoints 2 examiners, and this team of examiners lead the testing of the voting system, and they issue a report recommending whether or not to grant certification. After that report has been issued, the Secretary of State holds a public hearing regarding the application, and then only after that hearing takes place, then the Secretary of State makes a final determination on whether or not to certify the voting system in question. So you see, the testing process is going to be very similar to what it would be at the federal level. But there is the added part where the Secretary of State has to hold public hearings and take comment on the certification. All right, so what kind of system, what kind of voting system standards is the Secretary of State looking for? You can see they're slightly different than the federal level. So, in Texas, a voting system may not be used in an election unless the voting system, one, preserves the secrecy of the ballot, and two, complies with the voting system standards adopted by the Election Assistance Commission. Those are the voluntary voting system guidelines. Safe from fraudulent or unauthorized manipulation, permits voting on only the offices and measures on which the voter is entitled to vote, prevents counting a vote on the same office or measure more than once, or a vote for more than one candidate for the same office, permits write in voting, and it's capable of providing records which may be audited. There are a couple of other requirements as well. So they obviously have to meet all the voting system standards that we just mentioned on the previous slide. And actually, since September 1st, 2021, the system must be manufactured, stored, and held in the United States and sold by a company whose headquarters and parent company's headquarters, if applicable, are also located in the United States. All voting machines must also have a security system capable of preventing operation of the machine. And they have to have registering counters, a public counter, and a private counter. And these various counters keep track of recorded votes. There's one other additional requirement specifically for electronic voting systems. So your direct recording electronic systems. And that is that copies of all the program code, any other software, and the user and operator manuals must be filed with the Secretary of State prior to the voting system being certified. So, you see at the federal level, it's a very involved process. At the Secretary of State level, it's also a very involved process. So, by the time a voting system is finally certified for use in Texas, it's undergone months and months of testing for various different aspects. If it's an electronic system, the Secretary of State's offices look through the program code. They've looked through the software code, all the user manuals, operator manuals. Again, all of this is to say that this is a very lengthy process with a lot of experts, a lot of technical experts involved, and it's just not something that can be done in a very short period of time. And with that, we come to President Trump's March 2025 executive order. So among other things, the two sections of this executive order that are relevant to our discussion tonight are section 4B1 and 4B2. So 4B1 demands that the EAC change their current voluntary voting system guideline for certifying voting machines, right? And demands that they change it to prohibit the use of any barcode or QR code in the vote tabulation process. If you remember, a couple of slides ago, I mentioned that some of the optical scan voting machines that are used in Texas use this QR code or a barcode in the scanning process. Also, Section 4B2 demands that by September 25th, so 2 days from now, the EAC review and, if appropriate, recertify all voting machines under the new standards established in 4B1 and this is the big part, and decertify all voting machines that were certified under previous standards. So remember, we spent the last 6 or 7 slides going through this entire process. And remember, that process has to be individualized. So every one of these voting systems, by the EAC's own standards, have to be looked at separately. There can't be a blanket decertification or a blanket certification of voting system standards under the EAC's own rules. So this flies in the face of the procedures and policies that are in place for the certification and decertification of voting machines. I did put a link to the executive order there. As I mentioned, these two sections about the EAC and voting system certification are not the only things that this executive order mentions. I did do a presentation on late August with the League of Women Voters of Collin County on this executive order, where we go into more depth and detail about that. That link is also on our YouTube channel as well, if you are interested in finding out more about this particular executive order. Last thing I would point out is that there are multiple lawsuits that have been filed and are in various stages against this executive order. So that is definitely something that is still pending, and it's still an issue that we need to keep an eye on. All right, so what would the potential impact of this executive order be on our fellow Texas voters? Well, as to recap, as previously mentioned, only two manufacturers have voting machines that have been certified by the EAC and the Secretary of State. And again, that's ES&S Software and Hart InterCivic. The real problem is that the ES&S machines used in 130 counties across the state utilize a barcode scanner, and thus they wouldn't meet the new requirements demanded by the executive order. And in those 130 counties, there are approximately 7.7 million registered Texas voters. So if the EAC gives into the demands found in the executive order, we would have millions of our fellow Texas voters, well over half the counties of our state. They would have their voting machines decertified less than 2 months before our next statewide election. The next statewide election is November 4th. They would be decertified about 6 weeks before that. So like I said, it is a major thing. We are going to be watching the rest of this week when this deadline comes and goes. My best guess at this point in time is that this decertification will not happen in 2 days. The EAC has been, aside from also talking about new voluntary voting system guidelines, they have also been talking about the executive order and whether or not to comply with it, and if so, how to comply with it. So, but yes, it is something that you might want to keep an eye on the next two or 3 days. I know that we at TCRP are going to be keeping an eye on it as well. All right, and so from there, we're going to shift gears wildly. This is going to be a big gear shift change here. So let's talk about testing voting systems, right? So if we kind of imagine this timeline of events that we're talking about, right? So we have all of the federal certifications been done, all of the state level certifications been done, right? So now we have the machines, we have the voting systems, right? And these voting systems are about to be deployed before election day, or before early voting, actually. But before any of these voting systems are actually sent to polling places, they have to go through a couple of different kinds of tests. So the first is a hardware diagnostic test, then something called a hash validation, a logic and accuracy test, and then the last one is a little bit different because this happens after the election. But after the election, there's something called a hand count election audit. We'll talk about what that means in just a couple of slides. All right, so let's start with this hardware diagnostic test. This is fairly straightforward. The general custodian of election records, you're going to see that term a lot. So just know that that's going to be either the county clerk or the election administrator. The general custodian of election records conducts a successful hardware test before a voting system is used in an election. And this is literally just making sure that equipment turns on, it functions properly, powers up, all of that. So this is like the bare minimum standard of the test, right? This is the very first test. And then, just the hardware diagnostic test has to ensure that each part of the system functions properly as prescribed by the Secretary of State. So that one's very straightforward. Second type of test that's going to be done is what's known as a hash validation. And that is a hash is a mathematical function that when you apply it to a file, it creates this unique string of letters and numbers. And you can cross-reference that with what's known as a trusted hash file. And if they match completely, if they're identical, that confirms that the voting system and its source code haven't been altered or tampered with. So these hash validations have to be run on each ballot marking device, each unit of automatic tabulating equipment, and each tabulation computer. So yeah, like I said, just to rehash, sorry, no pun intended. Just caught myself in that. But to rehash, a hash file is generated by the equipment being tested, matched to a hash value from a trusted hash file, and then you match those up if they're identical. The program hasn't been corrupted or altered. The Secretary of State put a little graph on the side, or I put a graph from the Secretary of State on the side there. It kind of shows you just, in visual form, how this hash validation test works. All right, so moving forward in time, after hash validations, we have what's known as a logic and accuracy, or an LNA test. There's one that's done on the voting systems. There's a separate one that's done on the electronic poll books. We'll talk about that on the next slide. But a logic and accuracy test is used to verify that DRE voting systems perform as expected, right? Remember, DRE are the direct recording electronic, so that's your touch screens, ones that use like the spinning wheel that have buttons. They use some tactile method for casting votes on a screen. So the easiest example of the logic and accuracy test is, if a voter actually, if they push the button or touch the screen for John Smith for mayor, the machine itself obviously needs to record that vote correctly. So that's what these logic and accuracy tests are testing for. They're testing to see that the systems are performing as expected. So these tests they must be conducted publicly, and it has to be done at least 48 days before election day. And at least 48 hours notice has to be given to the public as to the time and place of the test. So many times you will definitely see like public announcements where a county says, hey, we are having a logic and accuracy test for our voting systems. This is the time, this is the place. This is why they have to be conducted publicly. Then the general custodian of records, again, the county clerk or election administrator, selects a testing board of at least 2 people, and they're supposed to make every reasonable effort to ensure that the testing board consists of at least 1 person from each political party that holds a primary election. And in Texas, when you see that phrase, each political party that holds a primary election, that means the Democrats and the Republicans. All right, so there's also a logic and accuracy test that has to be done on the electronic poll books, right? Again, this test also has to be conducted publicly with notice given to the public. They're looking for slightly different things here. The county clerk or election administrator is specifically testing to verify whether or not the electronic poll book is working properly. So they're looking to make sure that the database of voters is correctly loaded onto the system and all devices. All peripheral devices used with the system are functioning correctly. Ballot styles have been correctly assigned to voters. Are voters receiving the actual ballot for where they're registered to vote? And then any ballots that are issued by the system and any peripheral devices used with the system are correctly read. So, are all the ballots and everything being read properly as well? Okay, so those were the tests that have to take place every election for all of the types of voting systems. This one, like I said, is a little bit different because this actually takes place after elections. And I'll say upfront that this only applies to counties that are using optical scan voting machines. So the general custodian of election records in a county using optical scan voting machines must conduct a manual count of all the races in at least 1% of the early voting polling locations and 1% of the election day polling locations, or 3 early voting polling locations and 3 election day polling locations, whichever is greater. So for most counties, it's probably going to be the 1% of early voting and election day polling locations. So these recounts have to begin no later than 72 hours after the polls close, and they must finish or conclude within 21 days after the election. So for statewide elections, and this includes primaries, the Secretary of State, and this is just a direct quote from the election code here, the Secretary of State selects not more than 3 offices and not more than 3 propositions to be audited, and must inform counties of those selections not earlier than the day after election day. So, the Secretary of State for statewide elections will literally pick 3 offices, up to 3 offices off the ballot, or 3 propositions if it's, a ballot that has, if it's an election that has propositions. And every county in the state has to audit those races, or every county in the state that uses optical scan voting machines has to audit those races. The first bullet point, where it's the general custodian of election records, they can select the polling locations, the precincts the polling locations, early voting and election day locations that they audit. And then in addition, if it's a statewide election, on top of those entire polling locations being audited, then the Secretary of State selects 3 offices or 3 propositions on top of those polling location audits. Guidance from the Secretary of State requires counties to include early ballots as well as election day ballots in these audits. So it's from, first day of early voting all the way through election day. So how are these audits actually conducted? The general custodian selects members of the early voting ballot board to actually conduct the audits. Once the polling locations are selected, the general custodian of election records notifies the public, and each candidate in the election is entitled to be present at the count or have a representative present at the count. And then not later than the 3rd day after the count is completed, the general custodian of election records delivers a written report of the results of the count to the Secretary of State. And again, this procedure explicitly doesn't apply to DRE voting system counties. It only applies when counties are using optical scan voting machines or voting systems. All right. And so for our last topic today, if you've ever wondered how voting machines are paid for, where do they come from? How are they allocated? How do we deliver them to polling locations? How do we determine how many go to each polling location? These are the issues that we're going to talk about in this last section of tonight's presentation. So we're going to talk about the procurement, allocation, and delivery of voting system equipment. All right, so election supplies. What are election supplies? It's literally just any supplies that are necessary to run an election. That includes voting system equipment. That includes paper ballots. That includes, everything. So who has the responsibility to procure all of that equipment, or I'm sorry, all of that election supplies? It depends on what type of what type of election is being run. So if it's an election that's ordered by the governor or a county authority, so statewide race, for instance, it's going to be the county clerk or election administrator of that county who has the responsibility of actually procuring all of the election supplies. For a primary election, it's the county chair of the political party holding the primary. Makes sense? If it's an election that's ordered by a city authority, so mayor or city council, the city secretary is going to have that responsibility. And then if it's an election that's ordered by an authority of a political subdivision other than a county or city, so think school board, community college trustees, municipal utility districts, those smaller political subdivisions, it's going to be the secretary of that subdivision's governing body, or if they don't have a secretary, the governing body's presiding officer. So these are the officials who are legally responsible for procuring and allocating all of these election supplies to each polling location. So let's start with the procurement part. So counties can contract to acquire voting machines and other necessary voting system equipment by purchase, lease, or other means. So they can rent them out as well. All such contracts, not a surprise, but all such contracts must be approved by the Secretary of State. To finance the procurement of this equipment, the Commissioner's Court can issue bonds that are payable solely from the county general fund. And then if you have a subdivision or a political party, they can also contract to obtain their own equipment, or they can enter into what's known as an election services agreement with the county to lease such voting system equipment. But if you're interested in this voting system equipment allocation and procurement discussion, last week's presentation that you, again, can find on our YouTube channel, last week's presentation went into this in more depth than what we're going to talk about it tonight. All right, so that's how the voting system equipment is procured. How is it allocated? The authority responsible for allocating election supplies. Spoilers, that's also the authority that is responsible for procuring these election supplies. So it's your county clerks and election administrators, city secretaries, and so on. They're also responsible for allocating election supplies. The way that the number of voting machines and voting system equipment that needs to be installed at each polling place, it's going to be based on a couple of different factors. First is the number of votes that were cast at the polling place in a previous similar election. So, for instance, if we're talking about the November 4th constitutional amendment election, then they would look at the number of votes that were cast in the last constitutional amendment election. Second would be the number of registered voters who are eligible to vote at a specific polling place. Third would be the number of units of equipment available. And then and this is kind of the catch-all, this last one, any other factors that authority determines are relevant. All right, so now we've procured the equipment. We figured out how many voting machines, how many other pieces of voting system equipment need to go to every polling location. How do we deliver and install that equipment then? So preparation of equipment for delivery. Before the voting system equipment is delivered to a polling place for use in an election, the authority responsible for distributing election supplies. Spoilers, that's also the same authority that's responsible for allocating and procuring election supplies. They also have to ensure that the equipment is in proper order for use. So they should go and test the equipment to make sure it powers on. All the equipment is in proper order. The Secretary of State prescribes specific procedures governing the delivery of voting system equipment to polling places, specifically to protect that voting system equipment from tampering and damage. Counties and other subdivisions have to follow those procedures. And then voting system equipment has to be installed at the polling place so that a voter can operate the equipment without violating ballot secrecy. So the same authority who has to distribute the equipment is also going to be responsible for the installation of the equipment at polling places as well. Just a couple of slides left. One is what happens when voting system equipment malfunctions. We unfortunately see that all the time. If it happens in a polling location, the presiding judge must stop using the malfunctioning equipment immediately after discovering the malfunction, and should have the equipment promptly repaired or replaced if possible. If the equipment can't be promptly repaired or replaced, and this is important, and voting can't be continued using only the remaining equipment without substantially interfering with the orderly conduct of the election, then voting can be conducted by one of the following methods in addition to or instead of using the remaining equipment. So basically, if there isn't enough equipment left to run the election in a efficient and timely manner, these methods that I'm going to mention in a second can be added to the equipment that's still functioning properly, or it can take the place of the functioning equipment as well. So the first would be using another voting system that has been adopted for use in that election. That's probably the least likely to occur, just because the logistics of getting a new voting system to a location is a little bit harder, especially in smaller areas that may not have that much voting system equipment. The second option is using regular paper ballots, whether those are early voting ballots or regular voting ballots on election day, or the presiding judge can actually have voters manually mark the electronic system ballots that were furnished for use with the malfunctioning equipment. And then he and the election clerks, or they and the election clerks, can process those ballots as regular paper ballots. So in other words, even though they were furnished for use with the equipment, election judges, election clerks can process them like they were just regular paper ballots. All right, and then this is the last slide, and then we'll take some questions. Voting system technicians. So on the request of the authority holding an election, a voting system technician can be at a polling place, a meeting of the early voting ballot board, or a central counting station specifically for the purpose of repairing, assembling, maintaining, or operating voting system equipment. And then what happens, how do you store this voting system equipment? How do you maintain it? The governing body of a political subdivision, so that's your county or city, your school board, municipal utility district, whichever political division it is, they have to provide for the proper maintenance and storage of the equipment that the subdivision acquires for use in the operation of a voting system. So whichever political subdivision purchases or procures the equipment, they're responsible for maintaining and storing it as well. And then a new rule that just came in after the regular session: equipment used in the operation of a voting system must be stored in a locked room. We have had some election administrators and county clerks mention this as being a little bit difficult for them to find all the polling locations that have a specific locked room that they can set aside for storing the voting equipment, at night when people are not voting on them. So something else that we're kind of looking into and seeing if this is going to cause, a difficulty in finding enough polling locations. With that is the end of my presentation. I'd love to open the floor for a question and answer session. Just to ask, please be respectful to your fellow attendees while asking questions. And then I'm going to leave it on this slide right here for any fellow legal professionals who are in attendance. This is the CLE course number. You can use that course number right there or use the QR code. And lastly, before I hand it over to my colleague Veronica, just remember that throughout the month, we are going to be posting recordings of these presentations on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to share that link with anyone who might be interested. And that's the link right there. So with that, Veronica, I'm going to hand the microphone over to you.
For sure. Hey, guys. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Does anyone have any questions? All right. Thanks so much, Kay. if there aren't any other questions, then we will wrap up, but just want to hold a little bit of space just in case anybody has anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And while y'all are thinking if you have any other questions or not, we do have, like I said, one more presentation next week. We're going to be working with our good friends over at Common Defense, and we're talking about Uwakawa. So we'd love to see y'all here next week also.
All right. Well, with that, I will stop the recording and thank you guys so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.